Hello, JBS viewers. This is Defending Israel with David Harris. We have a very special guest, Avi Mayer, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. And truth in advertising, I've known Avi for many years, and for 4 years, we were colleagues. It's good to see him in this position today. Avi, welcome to Defending Israel.
Thank you, David. Good to see you.
Avi, I know it's difficult, personally difficult, emotionally difficult, but take us back to October 7th. It was Shabbat. It was the end of the Sukkot holiday. You were thinking about the joy of the holiday, the shared joy, the collective joy. And then along came this news. How did you react, first of all, as an individual? And of course, you couldn't just react as an individual. You were also editor-in-chief of one of the principal sources of news for the entire global community. Take us back.
Well, David, as you said, Saturday, October the 7th was indeed the last day of Sukkot, or the first day of Simchat Torah. And I was in bed, quite frankly, when I heard the first rocket siren. I wasn't quite sure that that's what it was. I had to sort of strain to listen and see if that's indeed what it was. And I confirmed that that was what was happening. My sister happened to have been over for the holiday. We ran into a corner of my living room, and it felt like something weird was going on. This is a very unusual occurrence. It's rather uncommon for rockets to go all the way to Jerusalem. They generally, unfortunately, go to the communities closer to Gaza. And so I did something which is quite unusual for me. I turned on my phone on Shabbat, which I would not do otherwise. And at that time, initial reports were coming in of some kind of security incident taking place in the Gaza border communities. I decided to go to synagogue anyway. And I took my phone with me, which again, I would never do under other circumstances. And it was a very weird service because, as you said, it's generally a joyous holiday. We were anticipating many dozens of people, including many children. It's a very child-friendly holiday. We had about 12 people who came to services that day. And we ended up, I'm so sorry. Actually, we have a rocket alert right here in Jerusalem at this moment. Hold on one moment. Okay, it's not nearby. I think we're okay. That should just give you a sense of what the...
Please be safe first and foremost, Avi.
Thank you. Thank you. It looks like it's not in this area. The reality was that we only had about 12 people at the service that day. And every few minutes, we found ourselves running down to the bomb shelter. And every few minutes, I also looked at my phone and saw things developing rather rapidly. The first word we heard was, I think, that 22 people had been killed. And at the time, that seemed like an unfathomably high number. And then gradually, as the day progressed, that number climbed to 50, 100, 150, 250. We had no idea what we were dealing with at the time. But at that point, the holiday had basically been canceled. I was fully in work mode. And that's basically been the situation we've been in ever since. We have settled into something of a wartime routine. That's the best description I can give for it. The first few weeks were particularly difficult as the magnitude of this massacre became clear. But now I think Israelis are concerned mostly with banding together, supporting the troops who are on the front lines, doing what they have to do to eradicate Hamas's military capabilities, and keeping themselves safe and sane during a very difficult time.
Avi, thank you. The ancient Greek writer Aeschylus once said famously that truth is the first casualty of war. You're dealing with the media, and all of us around the world are reading the media carefully, sometimes critically, sometimes angrily. How would you assess the role of the Jerusalem Post in all of this, both as an Israeli newspaper and as a news source? And then let's talk about other news sources and how they're covering the story.
Well, David, we are a 90-year-old newspaper. We predate the state of Israel by 15 years, and we were created in order to serve as the voice of the Jewish community in what was then Palestine to the British Mandate authorities and to the world. And that's been our mission ever since. We view ourselves as the voice of this part of the world to the rest of the globe. We are the window into Israel, as you said, for so many around the world. We're the leading English language news source in Israel. And we take that responsibility very, very seriously. It's not always pleasant. It's not always easy. We talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of what happens here. But ultimately, I think the image that emerges is one of a country that is complex, but ultimately beautiful, and that has the righteous right, quite frankly, to be where it is, to live in a sovereign state, to have the ability to defend itself. I think these are fundamental rights that are shared by all nations in the world, and Israel certainly is no exception. And that's the sort of message that we try to convey in our reporting. One of the things that was important to me when I took on this role was setting out what our values are as a newspaper. And the first thing I said is we are a Zionist newspaper. We will not give space to anyone who tries to undermine Israel's basic legitimacy. And that remains true today, even as many around the world are trying to do exactly that, undermine Israel's very legitimacy, very right to exist. And unfortunately, as I think you alluded, we have not seen all of our counterparts in other news organizations hold themselves the same standards of truthfulness and integrity that we at the Jerusalem Post have. And there have been quite a few incidents, even in just the few weeks that we've been in this situation, in which I think many journalists and news organizations have fallen afoul of some basic ethical standards, have engaged in what I would consider to be journalistic malpractice. One of the most notable incidents, of course, was the explosion at this hospital in Gaza, which many organizations very swiftly rushed to blame on Israel, on a supposed Israeli airstrike in which 500 people were killed. So it turned out it was not actually in a hospital. It was in a parking lot outside a hospital. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was not actually an Israeli airstrike, but rather a Palestinian missile that had fallen short. And there wasn't 500 people who were killed, but rather several dozen. But at that point, the damage had already been done. So even though some responsible news organizations, by the way, including the New York Times, did afterwards issue corrections and mea culpas, at that point, this narrative had been set, and we're still suffering with the ramifications of that at this time. People are still talking about the Israeli airstrike that destroyed a hospital when it simply never happened. And so we, of course, will continue holding ourselves to that standard, and we'll continue holding our colleagues to that standard. We will talk about this. We will report when other news organizations get it wrong. We talk about this quite often. And I think that that's part of our role, to ensure that the reporting that's coming out of this part of the world is as truthful and as accurate as possible.
But Avi, I know that you're with the Jerusalem Post and not the New York Times. But is it malice aforethought? I mean, what leads a major news organization like the New York Times, perhaps the most known other than the BBC in the world, to rush to judgment with a headline that was as declarative as Israel strikes Gaza hospital, 500 dead? Was it simply malpractice, or was it malice aforethought? What do you think?
You know, it's hard for me to accuse people of having an ingrained bias against Israel or anti-Semitism being a key factor in their reporting. I think it's that those are charges that we should be very careful about flinging at anyone. But I do think that there is a sort of groupthink that many journalists who cover this part of the world share, that sees Israel as invariably the aggressor and Palestinians as invariably the victims. And it doesn't matter what the facts may be. It doesn't matter if the facts are even known. But that is the mindset that they're in. And so any events that take place on the ground, any developments, are seen through that prism. And I think that's something we see not only in the New York Times, but many other news organizations as well. And I think that really did come into play in that incident and many others that we've seen over the past few weeks. There have been many journalists who've actually written about this. Mati Friedman is one notable example. He was a bureau chief here at the Associated Press. He was an editor, at the Associated Press, which actually is on the same floor as our office here in Jerusalem. And after he left the AP, he wrote about this groupthink, this prism through which so many journalists see the conflict, and from which they find it very difficult to, quite frankly, free themselves. I think that's what we see reflected in a lot of reporting from the past few weeks.
So, obviously, since you're telling JBS viewers that AP is just on the same floor, maybe you could point out to them that I think as recently as yesterday, they had a report that declared that there were more than 10,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza. It was not attributed in the headline. It was simply stated as fact. It was repeated in the first paragraph, and it was not until the third or fourth paragraph that it was mentioned that the source was Gaza's Ministry of Health, which of course is Hamas governed. Again, AP is not a new news organization. So how does one explain this?
Look, it's hard for me to plumb the depths of the minds of my colleagues at the Associated Press or other news organizations. I think it should be obvious that when you're citing a terrorist organization, you should say that you're citing a terrorist organization that has made a practice of lying, does so very openly. You have these Hamas leaders who are going on TV still today and talking about how there were no civilians who were killed on October the 7th, how none of them were targeted. And you're looking like, what universe are you in? What universe do you think that we're in? How stupid do you think we are? And yet many news organizations swallow this stuff hook, line, and sinker. And so we at the Post have been very, very clear about when we cite the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, which we do occasionally, we will say it is the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. People should know where their information is coming from. That is basic journalism. That's basic sourcing. And that's something we will certainly hold ourselves to, and we certainly hope that our colleagues will do the same.
Avi, not just as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, but as an Israeli, one who made Aliyah some years ago, you've referred to, I think you called it moral idiocy. You've witnessed the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And yet you see, not just in the media, but on university campuses and in the streets of major cities from Berlin to London to New York, a response that shows support for Hamas and a complete lack of any empathy whatsoever, even for murdered Israeli children or elderly held captive by Hamas. How do you explain this?
I think that there are two groups of people who are involved in that kind of activism. I say that the leaders of those movements, those rallies, those efforts tend to be well-informed and ill-intentioned. And those who go along, who are often the majority, are often very ill-informed, but well-intentioned. They think they're doing the right thing. They think they're supporting the underdog, but they simply don't have the facts. And when you see people, young people in particular, putting Hamas and Israel on the same moral plane, which is what we see in these surveys that have come out in recent weeks, you have to think, where are they getting this information? How could they be so woefully ill-informed about what's going on in this part of the world? And, I think some of it is indeed malicious, right? You have the leaders of these efforts, the BDS movement and all of its subsidiary groups and Students for Justice in Palestine and its presence on campuses who are actively churning out this misinformation and these lies, these gross, grotesque distortions of fact and reality. And it's being swallowed up by people who genuinely want to feel like they're becoming involved in solving this humanitarian crisis around the world. And there is a humanitarian crisis. We should acknowledge it. The situation in Gaza is serious. But there's also a serious humanitarian crisis here in Israel. 1,400 people massacred, the worst mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis who've been displaced, who are out of their homes, if their homes even still exist, if they haven't been destroyed on that day. And so the fact that you have this mass effort of misinformation and distortion taking place on college campuses, on the airwaves, on social media, is, I think, producing what you're seeing in the streets and attacks on Jewish students, the sense of intimidation. We saw these videos. I saw a video, I'm sure you did as well, of the students at the library at the Cooper Union in New York who were barricaded by this mob outside. It almost felt like a bloodthirsty mob outside. That must be terrifying. And that's how those things come about. It's really a scary, scary time. And I don't envy any Jewish student on college campus today.
You yourself were once a student on an American college campus, as I recall. If you had the opportunity now to speak with, say, American college presidents, what would your message be to them?
My message would be that, you are often very eager to weigh in on all sorts of global issues. Ukraine and Russia, Black Lives Matter, all sorts of things have risen to the level of statements on the part of university presidents and chancellors and provosts. And yet this is one issue in which so many university leaders have been mealy-mouthed, have refused to take a true moral stand. And you have to wonder why that is and what message that sends Jewish students. Is it possible that university administrators view their lives as being less important than those of other students? I would certainly hope not. But there are many students who are feeling exactly that way. And by the way, many donors to these universities who are starting to say, if my grandchild doesn't feel comfortable on campus, you're not going to get any more of my money. And I think that's something that, I would have hoped that it wouldn't take that kind of messaging from donors to get university leaders to do the right thing. But maybe that'll actually work. Maybe those are the steps that need to be taken for university leaders to wake up and say, we should not give any harbor to hate speech, to any expressions of anti-Semitism, to intimidation of Jewish students on our campus. Maybe that'll work. I certainly hope so.
And you may have seen that the president of Brandeis University, Ron Leibowitz, in an op-ed yesterday in the Boston Globe, but also has said that Students for Justice in Palestine will no longer have a place at Brandeis University. They will no longer have access to funding from the university or to use of facilities. It sounds like that would be part of your message as well.
100%. Students for Justice in Palestine is essentially Hamas on campus. That is their ideology. We can talk about the origin of Students for Justice in Palestine, align with the Muslim Brotherhood and various individuals and groups that have been tied to actual terrorist organizations. But certainly ideologically, they are absolutely Hamas's twins. And we have to be very clear about that. And we should say so openly. And we should take the steps that are appropriate at those times.
Avi, until October 6th, the big Israel-related news story was the deep division over judicial reform and the larger political framework. October 7th, that all changed. I'm not sure that people around the world, including JBS viewers, necessarily understand that issue of national resilience, that notion of achdut, of unity under these circumstances. Can you talk a little bit about that Israeli spirit today and how those deep divisions have been replaced by this appearance of maximum national unity?
I have to say it's been remarkable to witness because, as you said, this is a country that was really being torn apart before October the 7th. There were these massive street protests. People were pitting brother against brother, and it felt as though this country was falling apart at the seams. And October 7th, of course, under the most horrific circumstances possible, the country banded together. And I think that's really been true ever since. You see members of Israel's Jewish and Arab communities, secular, religious, ultra-Orthodox, all coming together to support, first of all, the troops, the residents of southern Israel, the families of the hostages, and of course, those who've been tragically murdered in ways that I think we've really never seen before. You have some of Tel Aviv's top restaurants that aren't kosher making their kitchens kosher so that they can provide meals for the troops. You have these protest groups that were formed in order to bring down the government that are now banding together to ensure that they are sending troops to the front lines, which I said they would never do under the current prime minister. And so obviously we wouldn't have wanted it to happen under these circumstances, the most horrific circumstances certainly I've seen in this country in my lifetime. But I think there is some small measure of comfort in the fact that this country really has banded together in a remarkable way. And we can hope that that spirit of unity will carry us on into the future.
Add a few words to something you just said. You spoke about Israeli Arabs. I'm not sure that story has really gotten out around the world as much as it deserves. What has been the response of the Arab community in Israel after October 7th?
I think there were some concerns based on previous rounds of fighting that there may be mass protests of solidarity with Israel's Arab, on the part of Israel's Arab community with those in Gaza. And we have not seen that. We have seen actually, first of all, a remarkable calm in Arab communities, which I think is very much appreciated by Israeli authorities who certainly have their hands full. And many in Israel's Arab community have actually mobilized to support the troops. Many of them, in fact, certainly in the Bedouin community, actually serve in Israel's defense forces. We know that several members of the Bedouin community were themselves murdered on October the 7th. There are remarkable stories of heroism, of Bedouin Israelis rescuing Jewish Israelis that day in the fields around Be'eri and Reim and other such places. So Again, this sense of unity really has crossed through all segments of Israeli society. It's very, very heartwarming to see.
Avi, Israelis don't really have lots of time to look around the world, but you bring a global perspective. What countries in particular sort of stand out for you as having really demonstrated friendship for Israel during these last several weeks? And if I may, what countries might have disappointed you? And let me add, and where do the Abraham Accords countries fit into the picture?
I think the United States is certainly first and foremost in many Americans, many Israelis' consciousness. The fact that President Biden took the extraordinary step of flying to Israel on a solidarity trip, meeting with the families of hostages, was an extremely powerful moment. The fact that Secretary Blinken has been here several times, that the U.S. fleet has sent 2 carrier groups to the Eastern Mediterranean to deter Hezbollah and Iran from becoming involved. All that is very deeply appreciated by Israelis. I would say Germany has also stood out as a staunch friend of Israel. The chancellor visited Israel. Many German publications have been very supportive of Israel in recent weeks. I can tell you, we started a practice 2 weeks ago of featuring one hostage every day. I can actually show you on the front page of our paper. We have every single day we have the name and personal details and a photograph of a hostage, and we feature this every single day. And starting today, the German newspaper Die Welt, which of course is one of the most influential in Germany, has started doing the same in partnership with us. And that is an extremely powerful expression of solidarity and support. It's very much appreciated. There have been disappointments as well. I would say that some of Israel's Arab neighbors have disappointed Israel, particularly in the aftermath of that fake Israeli airstrike on the hospital in Gaza, when Jordan issued this blood-curdling statement and canceled the summit that was to have taken place the next day with President Biden and several Arab leaders. That was, I think, deeply disappointing to many Israelis because the Jordanians should and probably do know better. And other Arab countries, and particularly, I would say the Abraham Accords countries, have played a sort of tepid role, issuing condemnations, but not too harshly. I think there are many who see that there is going to be a future, and it's not in their interest to burn bridges with Israel. Ultimately, the strategic interests that are shared by Israel and the Arab countries that are part of the Abraham Accords are greater than any momentary incident like the current one. But we have to see what's going to be. And then, of course, there's the question of Qatar. Qatar has been an extremely complicated player in all of this. On the one hand, it has a close relationship with the United States. On the other hand, it hosts Hamas and has played a deeply unhelpful role in many respects in sort of funding Hamas and providing it with a platform. But on the third hand, at the moment, it's serving as something of an intermediary. We understand from a series of reports that it's playing something of a role in trying to ensure the release of at least some of the hostages. A lot of this is happening behind the scenes. We don't know exactly what their role is. We can only hope that it will be a constructive one that will ultimately, in fact, result in their release.
And on the fourth hand, Qatar, it's been discovered, is the major funder of many American universities. And there's a connection between that funding, it appears, and attitudes among students and faculty. But that's for another day. We have just a couple of minutes left, Avi. I want to get to a column you wrote recently, and I would encourage all JBS viewers to follow the columns that you, Avi Mayer, are writing from Jerusalem. The most recent one was "You're Not Part of Us," and you spoke about, in a way, the notion of cherem, of whether there are Jews who are so beyond the pale that they should, in a way, be marginalized, isolated, even excommunicated. In brief, what are you talking about?
Well, David, I actually relied on a Twitter thread by a former colleague of ours, Dan Elbaum, who now heads the Jewish Agency's North American delegation, in which he sort of introduced this concept, which is something that I'd been thinking about for a very long time. But I felt that he'd sort of given me license to put pen to paper. Look, there is a Jewish collective. There's a Jewish, you would say, zeitgeist. There's a sort of a moment that we all share. And there are certain people, certain individuals, certain groups that fall just outside of that and have made themselves, I would say, irrelevant to the Jewish conversation, and in many respects have put themselves outside the Jewish people. And these are individuals who are going around tearing down posters of kidnapped Jewish children. These are individuals who are participating in rallies in which there are cries of globalize the Intifada and from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which of course is a call for the eradication of Israel. These are people who are calling for Israel's hands to be tied and to deny the Jewish state the right to defend itself. I don't see that there's any way to excuse that behavior. And this goes well beyond differences of policy and critiques of Israeli actions, which are totally legitimate. You and I will agree that is totally fine. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about individuals who don't believe Israel has a fundamental right to exist, who don't believe that Jewish people have a right to sovereignty. And that's just not something I think any of us should be able to countenance anymore. And so it was a very difficult column to write. I didn't relish it at all. And I don't think many people who read it found it an easy read. But I think these were things that had to be said. And I hope that communities will start internalizing that there is right and there is wrong. And there are those who are part of us, and there are those who tragically, unfortunately, have put themselves outside of us, even as we hope that someday they will return to the fold.
And thank you for writing it, Avi. We have just a few seconds left, but hundreds of thousands of Jewish households across the United States will see this conversation between you and me. What's your message to American Jewry at this moment in time?
I think the messages that I have found most impactful, that have touched me most deeply over the past few weeks, have been simple expressions of love and care and support from people around the world, but particularly from American Jews, many of whom may not have such strong connections to Israel, but have that basic Jewish neshama, that sense of kinship with other Jews. And I think that has been something that I have found to be extremely impactful. And I think many Israelis feel the same. I would encourage you to keep expressing that in whatever way you see fit, whether it's taking to the streets, taking to social media, writing to your member of Congress, or just writing to Israelis and saying, I know what you're going through. I care about you. I love you. That is something that makes a huge difference, a world of difference, more than you could perhaps even imagine. This is a moment for unity. It's a moment for solidarity. It's a moment for drawing a line in the sand between what is right and what is wrong, and what is good and what is evil. And we know that collectively we stand on the side of the good. We need to make that very clear. We need to vocalize that. And we need to make sure that is something that reverberates around the world.
JBS viewers, I hope all of you will take to heart what Avi Mayer just said. This is David Harris, defending Israel. Am Yisrael Chai.